Hey, just want to make a video for those of you who are at home today, summarizing what we tried to accomplish in class today. We'll be posting also a video that we watched in class so you can get a sense for what we did, even though you weren't here. But maybe our first goal of the day was to introduce a new unit. And the unit that we're going to be talking through for the next few weeks is really the relationship of science and faith. The reason it's appropriate for us to do this unit in this class, Comparative Worldviews, is because largely we are comparing, in this case, the worldviews of theism and the category of worldviews that make up scientific naturalism. And so as we are comparing worldviews and explanations for the world in those two categories, one of the biggest roadblocks is really this misunderstanding of the relationship between science and faith. Now, I say a misunderstanding because actually, traditionally and historically, Christians understood that science and faith work together. As you can see here in the PowerPoint, Christians believed that there were sort of two ways that God reveals himself. Now, we might quibble with that and say there's three, but they often called it the two books of Revelation, meaning on the one hand, Scripture, God reveals himself through Scripture, or the Spirit of God illuminating Scripture, and then through creation, that these are the two books. With that in mind, we believe that science and faith do work together, that all truth is God's truth, and that there's not a boundary line. But maybe that's not how everyone sees it, and we're going to have to navigate that. Now, of course, the first thing what we have to understand when we compare worldviews is really how do you do that. So I wanted to show you that on this slide here. Let me get myself out of the way. When we are comparing worldviews, we have to realize that the right worldview is going to be able to do basically six things. It's going to have six things going for it that mark it out as true or as corresponding to reality. The first is it's got to have factual support. That's an obvious one. Don't really need to explain it too much, but we just basically say there's evidence that supports it. Now, interestingly, there are certain people who think of faith as more virtuous when it has less support or less factual evidence to support it. That's not my way of thinking, and I hope to explain that as we go here. But all we need to say here is that if your worldview is correct, there's going to be facts that support it. Secondly, it needs to be internally consistent. Any worldviews, any single worldview that is inconsistent cannot be correct. If you're answering questions in one section of your worldview that are inconsistent with your answers in another section, it simply cannot be correct. Third, and this is maybe the one that will play the biggest role for us, is it has to have the power of explanation. I sometimes use the shorthand phrase explanatory power. What we mean by this is any worldview, if it is correct, will be able to explain what we're seeing in the world around us. Or maybe, more to the point, what we're experiencing in the world around us. If, for instance, we see marks of the universe having a beginning point, then any worldview that's correct is going to be able to explain why we see those marks of a beginning of the universe. If we, for instance, note that human beings have a sense of right and wrong, and maybe even an impulse to do what is right, then we'd have to have a worldview that would explain to us why human beings have that impulse. Conversely, we see that human beings also have the impulse to do what they consider to be wrong, and we have to have a worldview that could explain to us why do human beings do that. Any correct worldview will have explanatory power to be able to explain what we see and experience in our worldview. Fourth, the correct worldview would have to be what we call elegant. Neither too simplistic or so vague that it's worth nothing, or too complicated where you're having to really rearrange aspects of it in order to fit observation. Anything that's too complicated or too simplistic simply doesn't work. What we're looking for is elegance. That's a term that scientists often use when they're thinking about what fits the evidence, what explanation accounts for any particular phenomena. We're looking for elegance of explanation, a beautiful formula that simply cuts to the heart of what we're observing in nature, that sort of thing. And invariably in history, Scientists have said this kind of elegance, this kind of beauty is a mark of the truth. If you're observing a particular phenomenon and you have 10 competing explanations, the most complicated ones aren't going to be correct. Instead, the most elegant explanation turns out to be the right one, invariably in the history of science, and as well in math. Fifth, has to have more than one line of evidence. We wouldn't come to any conclusion based on only one piece of evidence or one line of thinking, but rather a broad approach to the truth that says, I'm going to use all my avenues of epistemology. And then lastly, any correct worldview would be able to refute contrary views. For instance, there are certainly big questions that Christianity has to answer because people have maybe doubts or critiques of Christianity. And if we can't answer those questions, if there are simply no answers to those questions, then we'd have to seriously consider the veracity, the trustworthiness of Christianity as a worldview. Now, I believe that there actually are answers to why the world is the way it is, and I do believe Christianity has the most profound answers to life's biggest questions. But as we're comparing worldviews, as we're comparing these two categories of worldviews, theism and scientific naturalism, we're going to run into roadblocks. And one of those roadblocks is this sense that we are in a postmodern context. And that's going to make things, I think, rather complicated. For instance, if we start to think about truth in the postmodern context and trying to compare and contrast understanding of the truth, we certainly will have a bit of a shifting, moving target on our hands. And here on this slide, I hope to try to explain how that is. And it will actually reveal our second roadblock to this conversation being a healthy one. So as we think about truth, our definition of truth is that which corresponds to reality. Now, we do believe that God reveals this truth through Scripture and also through nature. But this statement is philosophically sound and could be used in any classroom, any university in the world, and the professor would have to agree, yes, that's right, truth is that which corresponds to reality. Of course, the next question is then, how much access to reality do human beings have? The postmodern thinking says, well, we don't actually have perfect access to reality. The modernist might say, well, we have these 5 ways that we can access what is truly real and what is actually true, or really true. And they would say, you can use science, or you can use reason, or your experiences, or what's been revealed to you, or legal historical proof. In all these ways, we can access reality. But of course, that's not how the postmodernist will think about it, especially if pressed on the issue. For instance, the postmodernist says, well, we're constructing reality for ourselves, or a reality for ourselves, an understanding of reality, in order to cope with the world around us and try to live meaningful lives. But if that's true, if the postmodernist is correct and we are constructing reality for ourselves, that might mean some routes to knowledge are more reliable than others, and conversely, that some are less reliable than others. It may be then, if the postmodernist is correct, that experience, revelation, and legal historical proofs are impacted, because your experiences are then merely what you have constructed for yourself. You have an explanation for what you experienced that you constructed for yourself. And so a postmodernist might say, your experiences are great, and I'm glad to hear about them, but they have no bearing on me, because you construct a reality for yourself, and I construct a reality for myself. And the same could be said for revelation. Nobody can truly be an authority if we're constructing reality for ourselves. We can't reveal reality to someone else. And lastly, if history is written by the winners, and the winners are just people who are constructing an understanding of reality for themselves, then whatever they wrote down or what they witnessed, all of those things are impacted and maybe unreliable. So in this case, what we end up with is a sort of second reason then that this conversation is difficult. The first is a postmodern context. The second is a sort of response, reaction to it that is itself maybe unhealthy. A natural reaction that has taken place in the public discourse is a heavy reliance on science and reason. They say these are the only ways to truth. These are the only reliable ways to truth. And I think this has happened largely because the modernist and the postmodernist agree that these two things maybe cut through all the fog and get us right to what we are most interested in, the reality of the situation. But in this case, it's dangerously close and maybe leans towards what's called scientism. And scientism is, I think, a rather rigid and maybe brittle way of thinking that a lot of people fall into. It would be pretty rare maybe for a Christian to be given over to this way of thinking of scientism, but in maybe the larger world, you will run into it here and there. And basically, I have it defined here as excessive belief in the power of scientific knowledge and techniques. The sense that science is our only reliable way to truth, and it can answer any question that's worth answering. And so it begins to be a bit circular. The person who's given over to scientism would say, science is our only reliable way to truth. But then, of course, science can only study nature. The following assumption then ends up being circular. They say, well, then therefore nature must be the only thing that exists. And it becomes circular. Scientism is a very narrow way of thinking and a very narrow belief set that only science can get us to the truth, and therefore everything about reality must in the end be natural. And it sort of excludes all other possibilities. That's our second roadblock to the conversation. The third is what's called the conflict myth. This generally observed and generally accepted idea that faith and science are simply at odds, that a thinking person won't have faith and that a faithful person isn't thinking. And I want to just show you three quotes here, although I'm noticing you won't get all the quotes in the video, but you will be able to see the PowerPoint eventually. I'll just read them to you. These are just three quotes of people who are trying to say faith and science are at odds. Here, Carl Sagan says, religions are tough. Either they make no contentions which are subject to disproof, or they quickly redesign doctrine after disproof. Near the core of the religious experience is something remarkably resistant to rational inquiry. His clear point is the idea that religion isn't a thinking thing. It resists rationality. Richard Dawkins, very famous in his scientism, says this: faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. What worries me about religion is that it teaches people to be satisfied with not understanding the world they live in. I'll let you read the Sam Harris quote for yourself because I don't have as much time as I'd like, but bottom line is there is this way of thinking out there that says science and faith are at odds, that there is conflict here. Now, I mention it to you for two reasons. One, it's this third roadblock in our efforts to compare and contrast theism with scientific naturalism. But secondly, I want to ask if this is correct. Is this true? Is faith somehow more virtuous if you're doing less thinking, less inquiry, less evaluating the evidence? I've heard certain Christians propose that faith is blind, and that's the virtue of it, that it's a blind sort of trust that says, I'll follow Jesus anywhere, anytime. But I want to suggest to you maybe that that's not exactly how God intended for us to approach life. Certainly we see moments in Scripture of God giving evidence to his people as to why they can trust him. And Jesus is not the least of that. Paul over and over argues that we have evidence for our faith, and that evidence is in the resurrection itself. So that being said, I'm going to argue that actually science and faith as modes of thinking and belief work together. But we're going to be arguing, in a sense, against the currents when we do that. And to prove that we're arguing against the current, I'm going to post a video for you to watch. It's from a movie called Inherit the Wind that came out in 1960 that very forcefully tries to communicate that science and faith are absolutely at war with one another. And so as you watch that video, just keep in mind, like, this is the point of the movie. They're trying to say there's conflict. And eventually we're going to show why we disagree with the idea that there's conflict between science and faith, or faith and reason. If you end up with any questions, email me. This is really fast overview. I'm certain you'll have questions. Just let me know and I'll try to help out. Thanks.